Assalamualaikum and hello. My name is Muhammad Amirul, as which you all know by now. And for our final project, we were tasked to do an overview on the Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA. So this would basically comprise of all of the lessons that we've been taught in the course MKAK 1013. So of course, we will start with the introduction. So EIA is a study to identify, evaluate, and communicate info about the impact of a prescribed project on the environment. It covers a wide scope and criteria such as buffer zone, air pollution, water pollution, geology, social and cultural ecology, land value, and etc. EIA study has to be conducted by an environmental consultant, as we know, who are registered with the Department of Environment, or DOE, under EIA Consultant Registration Scheme. And these are the key components and steps going from screening, scoping, impact assessment and mitigation, impact management, the EIA report itself, review and licensing, and lastly, monitoring. For this final project, we will be mainly focusing on scoping, impact assessment and mitigation, as well as some other components such as the risk assessment, health risk assessment, as well as the EMP, which is the Environmental Management Plan. So first, we'll talk about scoping and project description. What is scoping? Scoping is a systematic exercise that establishes the boundaries of your EIA and sets the basis of the analysis you will conduct at each stage. A quality scoping study reduces the risk of including inappropriate components or excluding components that should be addressed. It involves identifying all relevant issues and factors, facilitating meaningful public engagement and reviews, determining the appropriate time and space boundaries of the EIA, identifying the important issues to be considered in the EIA, and as well, it establishes what the EIA will include and how to put the EIA together in accordance with the TOR, or Terms of References. So how is it conducted? A project scoping basically can be carried out in these 9 steps. First, you have to set up the team of experts that will conduct the EIA, describe the project area and the area of project influence, outline project alternatives for preparation, implementation, and closure, and then conduct public meetings and stakeholder consultations, outline a set of environmental, biological, and socio-economic resources and issues, and then you can define a set of criteria to assess the planned project development, which will then lead to the identification of the project impacts during all of its stages. And then you can identify a set of data for baseline descriptions and potential additional data collection needs. And lastly, you can start inserting this information in the appropriate section of the TOR. So a bit of overview on the TOR itself. So the TOR, or scoping exercise, will identify key issues and further outline the environmental data collection that are required, determine the assessment techniques to be used, and identify the appropriate methodologies for impact prediction and assessment. So the schematic figure that you can see on the right side here is basically the flow chart of the submission of term of references for the detailed EIA report. Next, we will talk about the impact assessment and mitigation. So impact assessment refers to the detailed evaluation of the environmental and social impacts. So this includes qualitative descriptions such as measuring high, medium, and low impacts, and quantitative descriptions such as indicating the cubic meters of water withdrawn, sewage produced, and pollutant released. Mitigation, on the other hand, is the stage to determine the possible preventive, remedial, and compensatory measures for each of the adverse impacts evaluated as significant. The mitigation actions to address impacts. There are basically 4 major guidelines for devising mitigation actions. Firstly is identify the mitigation action that most reduce the impacts. Secondly, we will identify the mitigation actions that reduce the severity of the impacts. Thirdly, we will include the activities designed to monitor compliance with agreements established in the assessment. And finally, identify potential risks of accidents, malfunctions, and other emergencies that may occur. So a bit of info, this is just an added info on the mitigation hierarchy. The mitigation hierarchy is a widely accepted approach for environmental conservation. It sets prioritized steps to limit negative impacts as far as possible through avoidance, mitigation or reduction, restoration, and offsetting or compensation. The figure on the right side basically explains what I have mentioned in graph form. So now we will talk about the Environmental Management Plan, or also known as the EMP. The EMP translates the EIA approval condition into action. The EMP includes the legislative requirements in matters such as compliance with the Environmental Quality Act Amendment 2012, as you can see in the figure, which needs to be monitored and abided by. The EMP is a concrete plan of action, which is explicit, illustrative, action-oriented, time-bound, and definitive. So the figure on the bottom right-hand side basically explains the whole EMP process, starting from identify, going all the way to develop, implement, monitor, and lastly correct. This slide explains the environmental mainstreaming tools, going from competent person to environmental policy, followed by environmental regulatory compliance monitoring committee, environmental performance monitoring committee, mini laboratory, performance monitoring, compliance monitoring and impact monitoring, record keeping, data analysis and interpretation, reporting and communicator, future improvement / redundancy, and lastly with budget. Now we will talk about environmental auditing. It is a systematic, documented, periodic, and objective process in assessing an organization's activities and services in relation to these components. First is assessing compliance with relevant statutory and internal requirements. Next is facilitating management control of environmental practices, followed by promoting good environmental management, and then maintaining credibility with the public. Next up, raising staff awareness and enforcing commitment to the department environmental policy itself, and then exploring improvement opportunities, and finally establishing the performance baseline for developing an EMS. So the primary type of environmental audit that will be required by the DOE is usually the regulatory compliance type audit. Before we move on to environmental risk assessment, I would just like to point out in the previous slide that the audit process actually is commonly structured into 3 phases, which is pre-audit, mainly comprising of selecting the auditor and reviewing their preliminary information, and then on-site audit, which is opening the meeting, conducting the audit at site, and then closing the meeting, and finally the post-audit, which is to prepare the audit report itself and implement corrective and preventive action. So environmental risk assessment is conducted to assess the potential environmental risk associated with any economic activity. ERA describes the potential hazards and impacts and provides the necessary precautionary steps to address these risks. Potential environmental hazards that may require ERA to be conducted are hazardous scheduled waste, emissions, hazardous substances, liquid waste, environmental impact of raw materials, environmental impact of packaging as well. So the figure on this slide basically explains how we assess risks and the components, as well as how those components connect with each other. The main components are communicating and consulting, as well as monitoring and reviewing, with the steps being establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing the risk, evaluating the risk, and finally treating the risk. This was actually highlighted in a previous presentation that I've done for this module. So risk analysis is broken down into 2, which is qualitative and quantitative. So a qualitative risk analysis prioritizes the identified project risk using a predestined rating scale. Risks will be scored based on their probability or likelihood of occurring and the impact on project objectives should they occur. Whereas a quantitative risk analysis is a further analysis of the highest priority risk during which a numerical or quantitative rating is assigned in order to develop a probabilistic analysis on the project. So as I've mentioned before, previously I've done a qualitative risk assessment for an urban toll road in Australia. So this will just be a brief overview as to what it entails. So based on the control effectiveness rating and the selected consequence criteria, as you can see on the right hand side of the slide, a risk rating was able to be produced, basically describing the level of consequences and the level of likelihood going from A, B, C, D, E for likelihood and 1 to 5 for consequences. We have now reached to the end of the slide, and I'll be talking about the final topic, which is the health impact assessment. So health impact assessment is the process of estimating the potential impact of a chemical, biological, physical, or social agent on a specific human population system under a specific set of conditions and for a certain time frame. HIA may be applied for assessing the health impact of policies, programs, or projects. The main approach in HIA for EIA, as I've understood from throughout this course that I've undergone, is basically to assess the impacts of the proposed project on the health of the affected communities who reside within the vicinity, which means near the project area. However, because there is always the potential to transport pollutants over a distance, the affected communities may not be physically close even, and this could be through downwind or downstream from the project site. And the figure on the right basically explains the HIA procedures broken down into 5 stages. Screening, scoping, and appraisal, which is in the policy and program development phase for the prospective assessment. And then in the policy implementation phase is reporting, and finally monitoring. That will be all for my presentation. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.